I step into the classroom and the air already reeks of fear. Two clowns are running the show from the back. Park Kang-yu and his lapdog, Jae Young-chel. They're casually watching their lackeys turn a kid named Dong-gu into a human floor mat like it's just Tuesday morning entertainment. These guys clearly haven't heard the rumors about the new transfer student who just turned the cafeteria into a total war zone. Today, they're getting the live uncut version. I don't waste time with small talk. I walk straight up to the first idiot blocking my path and ask him one simple question. You the boss here? Instead of answering like a normal human, the guy decides to flap his gums. Big mistake. I slap him so hard his ancestors feel it. His body folds like cheap origami and kisses the floor before his brain even catches up. Every girl in the room suddenly forgets how to blink. Yeah, I know I'm stupidly handsome, but we're not here for fan service. The second goon jumps up, yelling some bullshit about, do you know who we are? Bro, I just transferred today. How the hell would I know? He throws a weak punch that I catch midair like it's nothing. Then I start bending his fingers the wrong way until they make that lovely wet cracking sound. He starts squealing like he's hitting notes that would break glass. While he's making all that noise, I ask him again, real calm, who's the boss? Pain is an excellent teacher. He immediately sells out his leader and points straight at Park Kang-yu like a snitch on day release. Kang-yu looks like he just got stabbed in the back by his own dog. Before he can say a word, I put his loyal pet to sleep with one final vicious slap. Now the stage is clear. I stroll up to Kang-yu, same question. He chooses violence, or at least tries to. He starts yapping threats. I answer with a slap that spins his head like a fidget spinner. He swings back desperately, but I slip it so easily it's almost insulting. 2 clean shots to the face. Then I boot him so hard he flies straight through the window like a rejected mannequin. Glass explodes. He lands outside in a bloody heap, ego more broken than his ribs. I walk out the same way I came in, calm as death. Behind me, Dong-gu is still trying to remember how to breathe, and some girl in the back row looks like she's one wink away from falling head over heels. A few minutes later, Dong-gu hunts me down in the hallway, eyes shining with that classic, please be my hero energy. He starts preaching about justice, protecting the weak, ending all bullying, the whole righteous speech. I just stare at him. Look, I just transferred here from Blackhead, one of the top global hitman organizations on the planet. My deadbeat dad froze every single one of my accounts the moment my mom finally walked out on his toxic, controlling crap. Right now, I'm one missed paycheck away from sleeping in a cardboard box behind the school dumpsters. I've got a Burger King interview in 20 minutes. I don't do righteousness, I do straight capitalism. Dong-gu keeps trauma dumping. Teachers look the other way. His life is just an endless cycle of getting his ass handed to him every single day. I get it, kid. I really do. But sympathy doesn't buy me a Whopper with cheese. He finally catches the hint and drops the magic number, 50,001 per head. I put to sleep. My soul does a full 180. Suddenly, I'm the most motivated mercenary in the entire damn country. Night fell, and the target was a group of losers having a pizza party in the park. The Du brothers, Du-dong and Du-hyung, were sitting there laughing like they owned the city. Dong-gu was hiding, wearing a horse mask. Don't ask. The kid's a weirdo, whispering about how dangerous these guys were. He claimed they were the real shadows behind the school, not like that puppet Kang-yu. I didn't care if they were the Avengers. I just saw $100 sitting at a stone table. I didn't wait for a plan. I launched myself at Du-dong while he was mid-chew. My knee met his face with the force of a high-speed collision. His pizza went flying, and his nose turned into a fountain. Mina was there too, naturally, nearly dropping her phone in excitement. The other brother, Du-hyung, spat out his cigarette and tried to act tough. He is stunned, wondering where my backup is. He doesn't realize I am the backup. I hit him with a punch that turns his nose into a leaking faucet, but I'm not done. I aim a lightning-fast kick directly at his lower-tier vitals, the ultimate vasectomy. I hit him with a strike so fast and intense, it felt like a ball of fire exploding in his face. By the time I was done, the park looked like a disaster zone, and the brothers were out cold. Another night, another payday. By morning, things got weird. Dong-gu and some kid in glasses decided to turn me into a brand. They were handing out flyers with my face on them, and they actually had 2 guys carrying me around on a literal throne like I was some ancient emperor. It was humiliating, but as long as the money kept coming, I figured I could play the part of the board king. But then, I checked the invoice. 10 bills? I did the math. I took down the twins and their 2 lapdogs. That's 4 heads. I told Dong-gu to stop the cap and cough up the extra 100,001. I knew his family was loaded. The whole school knew it, so I wasn't letting him slide on the maintenance fees. He looked shocked that I'd scouted his financial situation. But hey, A professional always does his research. Meanwhile, the classroom was turning into a shrine. Girls were fighting over my promotional posters like they were limited edition merch. Mina, who has clearly decided I'm her future husband without consulting me, was busy terrorizing anyone who touched her man's picture. She was literally threatening to end people over a piece of paper, but the honeymoon phase didn't last. A text popped up on Mina's phone, and the vibe turned cold. Donggu led me to a back alley to scout the next boss on the list, Jang Hyun-yu. This guy wasn't a joke. 3-time amateur boxing champ, built like a tank, and possessed the kind of cruelty that makes even bullies uncomfortable. We watched him from a balcony as he sat on some poor kid's back like he was a human lawn chair, casually smoking. Donggu started shaking, rambling about how this guy was a cadre for some 12 national groups nonsense. He warned me that Hyun-yu doesn't just win fights, he breaks people for fun. He's the type of guy who smiles while he's crushing your spirit. Honestly, I stopped listening the second I saw the guy down in the alley. He was cornering Mina, acting like some low-rent mafia boss, while his lackeys, the same losers I'd already embarrassed, watched from the sidelines. Hyun-yu was busy trying to sweet-talk Mina into a date, or more likely, into a kidnapping. He was pulling the nice guy act, but his eyes said he'd enjoy breaking her spirit. I decided to announce my arrival with a glass bottle. I aimed just close enough to make him rethink his life choices, and the sound of it shattering against the wall was my version of a doorbell. I walked in, hands in my pockets, looking bored. Mina looked at me with those rose-tinted eyes again, probably thinking I was her knight in shining armor. I grabbed her face, not to be romantic, but to check if she was a spy sent by my old man. Her response? She enjoyed every second of it. Seriously, the girl is a walking red flag. Hyun-yu didn't appreciate the interruption. He lunged at me with a special boxing technique, a straight punch with a lot of weight behind it. I used the most advanced combat tactic known to the Blackhead organization. I spat on him. It was gross, it was petty, and it worked like a charm. While he was distracted by the sheer disrespect of it, I buried my foot in his stomach. The guy didn't know when to quit, so I introduced him to some furniture. I grabbed a chair and made it look like I was swinging high, then transitioned into a low blow that caught him right in the jaw. Then, I decided to finish the job. I used the chair to systematically crack his ribs, one side, then the other. I could hear the bones snapping like dry twigs. I didn't just beat him. I sat on the chair over his broken body like it was a throne. I leaned in and gave him a professional warning. If I see his face again, I'm not just coming for him, I'm coming for everyone he loves. I'm the son of an assassin, and I know how to make threats that stick. Of course, the power vacuum didn't stay empty for long. Enter Lim Trong-byum. He's the kind of guy who hangs out in boxing gyms and hits his own subordinates for fun. When he heard about Hyun-yu being hospitalized and the judo twins having their, let's say, private property crushed, he lost his mind. He's a thug who thinks he's a king because he's a year older than everyone else. He started barking orders to find the new kid who was obsessed with pork stir-fry. Back at school, it was club selection day. Mina was having a full-blown internal meltdown, imagining us as the stars of the film club, living out some romantic drama. She was literally threatening to murder any girl who touched one of my posters. But I have priorities. I didn't join the film club. I joined the anime club. Apparently, it's the sacred land of the otakus. Donggu looked like I just walked into his church and started knocking over the statues. He was offended that a cool kid like me was invading his territory, but I didn't care. It was the only club that looked like it had zero drama. I was minding my own business, finishing a carton of milk, when the goon squad finally tracked me down. Park Kang-yu was there, pointing me out to the new boss, Lim Trong-byum. They were standing there, trying to look intimidating, rambling about broken eggs and revenge. But then I saw it, something way more important than a bunch of local thugs. My eyes locked onto the target, and I didn't even give the bullies a second glance. I took off like a heat-seeking missile, sprinting at full speed. The bullies were stunned. They thought I was launching a reckless head-on charge. Lim Trong-byum really thought he was the main character. He stood there, flexing his boxing stance, and barking about how beating me would be interesting. Honestly, the only interesting thing was how much air he was wasting. He threw a straight punch that was so slow, I had time to contemplate my life choices before leaning an inch to the left. He tried again, and I just performed a casual backflip like I was in a gymnastics recital. I didn't even bother looking back at him. I had bigger problems to deal with. Specifically, a pink-haired stalker problem. Mina was wandering around with her friend John, convinced I'd joined the film club, because we're destined. I sprinted past the goon squad and tackled her to the ground. The posters of my own face she'd been hoarding went flying like confetti. I pinned her down, demanding to know if my old man sent her to spy on me. Most girls would be terrified, but Mina? Her brain was short-circuiting with joy. She was literally having a romantic fantasy while I was interrogating her about international assassins. Meanwhile, Byum was having a full-blown tantrum in the background. His ego was bruised because I'd ignored his ultimate technique to go talk to a girl. He came flying through the air like a budget superhero, aiming a stomp right at my head. I grabbed Mina, rolled us out of the way, and watched his foot crack the pavement. The guy started foaming at the mouth, calling me a small fry. I just looked at his bald head and wondered if he'd ever considered a career in plumbing instead of losing fights. He launched a frenzied attack, swinging like he was swatting flies. I parried a few hits just to be polite, but before I could end his career, a whistle blew. Entered Ding Kwang Do Chian, the man with the stick. He started screaming about outsiders, causing trouble. Byum tried to play it cool, acting like he was doing me a favor by stopping. He leaned into my ear, whispering that it wasn't over, and that he'd see me after school. He even lit a cigarette like he was in a noir film. I don't do sequels. As he turned to walk away, I stepped up and buried my elbow into the back of his neck. The cigarette flew out of his mouth. His eyes rolled back, and the mid-level boss hit the dirt like a sack of potatoes. The entire courtyard went silent. Donggu stopped chewing his bread, and Park Kang-yu looked like he'd seen a ghost. They all thought I had a death wish, because Byum's big brother was the final boss. And speaking of the final boss, meet Im Trong Tran. This guy is a literal psychopath. While I was dealing with school drama, he was in some hideout pouring boiling water on a kidnapped guy and using a girl's face as an ashtray. He's one of the 12 national groups, a collection of the most dangerous thugs in the country. He got the call about his brother Bayom getting handled, and suddenly, the school incident became a top priority. While the criminal underworld was mobilizing for war, I was stuck with a mop. The school dean caught me and sentenced me to a week of cleaning the second-floor toilets. I was standing there with 2 scrub brushes, questioning my life, while Donggu was vibrating with anxiety. He started rambling about the 12 national groups and how they never let blood go unpunished. I stood there and told Donggu, I'm done. This hero-for-hire gig is a scam. I'm getting hunted by national-level thugs, mopping floors, and being stalked by a girl who definitely needs therapy, all for a few thousand won? No thanks. I'd rather flip burgers at Burger King. He started yapping about how he's paying me way more than any entry-level job, and even tries to sweeten the pot with severance pay. Look, kid, I appreciate the hustle, but I'm not trying to have a 12 Nations hit squad as my morning alarm. I tell him to kick rocks and wander off to find a life that doesn't involve resetting people's facial features every 5 minutes. Poor Donggu. He took his backpack and started walking home. His vibe goes from protected by a god to walking target. He's walking down the street, reminiscing about the one time he actually stood up to a bully because he had me as his backup. He thought his days of being a human punching bag were over, but the universe has a sick sense of humor. Suddenly, this random NPC slides an arm around his shoulder, like they're long-lost brothers. Before Donggu could even scream, he was dragged to a trash-filled alley. A luxury white car was parked nearby, looking completely out of place in the filth. Byum was there, looking annoyed, asking where the new kid was hiding. Donggu tried to play dumb, but these guys weren't looking for excuses. They kicked him so hard his glasses flew across the concrete. They told him to call me, or they'd start making sure he never breathed through his nose again. Donggu was shaking like a leaf, trying to fumble with his phone, while blood leaked out of his nose like a broken faucet. Instead of calling me, the genius decided to try his luck with the police. I mean, points for being a law-abiding citizen, but in a manhwa, calling 112 is basically a signal for the bullies to kick you harder. The NPC caught him mid-dial, looking at the screen with that "you really thought you did something" smirk, before his goons started using Donggu's ribs as a staircase. They laughed about how the cops wouldn't save him, while Byum stood there, watching the show like it was a premium Netflix special. While Donggu was getting turned into a floor mat, I was at Burger King, trying to convince the owner I was a normal human being. My resume is basically a list of ways to kill people: close quarters combat, weapon modification, and apparently a black belt in throwing awards like they're ninja stars. The owner looked about as bored as I was, until a couple of local scam artists walked in. One big guy and one human-shaped tub of lard tried the oldest trick in the book. "There's a cockroach in my burger. Give me money or I'll call the cops." The owner was ready to pay them off, just to stop the headache, but I accidentally bumped into the fat one on my way out. He tried to give me the death stare, but I just looked at him with zero interest and asked what his problem was. Let's just say he realized very quickly that I wasn't on the menu. Outside, the sun was setting, and the vibe was getting rancid. Baeom and his crew were wandering around, spitting on the ground near where they'd left Donggu's broken glasses. They were annoyed they hadn't found me yet, unaware that I'd walked right past the high-ranking heavyweights of Yanhai. Im Dong-chan, the rank 2 psycho, and Choi Hyo-chang, the rank 5 meathead, passed me on the street. We locked eyes for a split second. Purely professional, like two predators, recognizing each other's scent. When they arrive at Burger King, the scene is devastating. The place has been completely trashed, leaving everyone in shock. While the question of who dared to commit such a bold attack hangs in the air, Dong-chan notices a detail everyone else missed. As he passed by, his sharp eyes has caught a tiny, incriminating red stain on my shoulder. He's sharp. He knew that wasn't strawberry jam. He immediately ordered his lapdogs to hunt down the kid in the Sunhai uniform. I was heading home, nursing a drink, when I saw a ghost walking toward me. It was Donggu, looking like he'd gone 10 rounds with a wood chipper. One eye was swollen shut and his face was a map of bruises, but the first thing he said was that he was glad I was safe. The kid has a serious case of sidekick syndrome. Naturally, the universe didn't want us to have a quiet moment. Choi Hyo-chang, the rank 5 lard bucket, came waddling up with his arm fat flapping in the wind, barking about how he was the king of Yu-Gi-Oh! He was waving his stubby fingers at me, demanding I come over so he could teach me a lesson. I didn't even look at him. I just took a sip of my drink, turned to Donggu, and asked if the 50,000 won bounty was still active. Donggu smiled through the blood and confirmed the price, though he made sure to mention there was no retirement plan included. That was all the motivation I needed. Hyo-chang swung a fist that had all the speed of a tectonic plate. I didn't even break a sweat. I launched my drink into his face, blinding him with soda, and before he could blink, I stepped into his personal space. I grabbed him by the shoulder and executed a judo throw that sent all 300 pounds of him rotating through the air. He hit the pavement with a sound like a wet sack of flour hitting a wall, his belly popping out of his shirt like a cry for help. I followed up with a crushing blow to the face. The sound of the impact echoed off the trash cans and the rusted bicycles. A spray of red mist hit the air as I finished the job, leaving him twitching in the dirt. His two lackeys stood there paralyzed. One was literally holding his mouth to keep from vomiting. I didn't even give them a full glance. I just ran a hand through my hair and asked Donggu if there was a performance bonus for efficiency. Cut to a few minutes later, and we're sitting in a cramped shop. World-ending threats forgotten for a bowl of gunpei. It's a legendary budget mix, ganjampong and jaja spaghetti. Donggu was rambling about the economic efficiency and the harmonious blend of spice and noodles, like he was a food critic and not a guy who nearly died an hour ago. I'm sitting there, slurping down noodles like they're the last meal on death row, and I decide it's time to talk business. I look Donggu dead in the eye, well, the one eye that isn't swollen shut, and tell him I want a 5 million won performance bonus. The kid literally sprayed a mouthful of half-chewed noodles across the table. Luckily, I've got assassin tier reflexes. I snatched a plate and used it as a tactical shield before a single drop of gunpei could ruin my blazer. I didn't even blink. I told him the deal. 5 million, and I dismantled the entire Yu-Gi-Oh! Gang in 1 week. 7 days to turn a criminal empire into a landfill. Donggu didn't just laugh. He cackled like a hyena with a head injury. He thought it was the funniest joke he'd ever heard. Once he finally caught his breath, he asked why the hell a high schooler needed that much blood money. I didn't tell him I was a disinherited prince with a frozen bank account. I just turned the question back on him. I asked why a rich kid, with parents living the high life abroad, lets himself get treated like a human stress ball every day. I told him straight up, if you act like a clown, don't be surprised when people treat you like a circus act. I finished my meal, grabbed my trash, and left him sitting there in the dark to think about his life choices. I stepped out into the neon glow of the street, and of course, there she was. Mina, reapplying her red lipstick like she was prepping for a movie premiere. She and her sidekick John, coincidentally, crossed my path. I've seen better stealth from a drunk rhinoceros, but I just kept walking. I had bigger fish to fry. Meanwhile, back at the villain's lair, Im Trong-chan was having a literal meltdown. He was staring at the mangled remains of his goons, his veins popping out so hard they looked like a roadmap. He bellows at his trembling lackeys, ordering them to get Park Kang-yu on the line immediately. The next day, Donggu sat me down to explain the true nightmare of Yanhai. It's a place where the students are basically a private army. They're led by Pig Chan, a guy who's part of the 12 national groups. This guy isn't a bully. He's a professional parasite. He sits on a throne of stolen motorcycles, runs insurance scams on the elderly, and makes more money in an hour of extortion than most people make in a month. He's got dead white eyes and a soul made of ice. I decided it was time to introduce myself. I dragged Donggu to the gates of Yanhai. The kid was wearing a splotchy unicorn mask for disguise, because nothing says low profile like a neon mythical creature. I pulled out my customized handgun, loaded with high-impact rubber bullets. Donggu was vibrating with terror, rambling about how the police are useless and the gang is too big to fail. I told him to relax. The bigger the target, the harder it is to miss. 2 students were blocking the street, puffing on cigarettes and acting like they owned the pavement. I walked up and asked if one of them is Pig Chan. The redhead started talking trash, but I didn't let him finish the sentence. I put a rubber slug into his kneecap. As he went down, I put another one right in his mouth. His buddy tried to lung at me, screaming about how crazy I was. I didn't even waste a bullet. I swung the barrel of the gun like a club, cracking his shoulder with enough force to shatter the bone and burst every blood vessel in the vicinity. I pinned him to the ground with the muzzle against his temple. He looked like a rabbit in a snare, shaking and sobbing. I gave him a simple order: call the boss, now. Deep inside the school, Dong Beom was sitting in a room full of envelopes, counting his extortion money like a corrupt bank teller. He was complaining about his sore neck. Suddenly, one of his lackeys burst in, looking like he'd just seen his own funeral. Big trouble, Beom. Yeah, you could say that. The trouble is currently standing on your doorstep with a gun, and he's looking for a 5 million won payday. The stakes just hit the ceiling, and the countdown for Yu-Gi-Oh! Has officially started. Meanwhile, Park Kang-yu is standing off to the side, looking like a human punching bag with a nose that's leaking more red syrup than a broken vending machine. He's watching Im Trong-chan take a phone call about some spy with a gun wandering the halls. I finally found a group of students, and because Donggu is useless at briefings, I had to ask 2 girls if they were Pig Chan. Apparently, the legendary leader is a guy. Who knew? Not me, because my intel is provided by a kid in a unicorn mask. Suddenly, I felt the air shift. I tilted my head just as a red and white box whistled past my ear, smashing into the floor. The bald guy, Dong Beom, stepped out of the shadows, flanked by enough goons to start a small riot. He started barking about me being insane for walking into the tiger's den. I didn't feel like a guest, so I decided to redecorate. I pulled the trigger on my rubber bullet special, ready to paint the room with yellow projectiles, but the mag ran dry. I tossed the gun aside like yesterday's trash. Empty. Dong Beom looked like a rabid dog. He charged me, screaming about how I had a death wish. I slipped his punch like it was moving in slow motion and reached into my blazer. He froze, probably expecting me to pull out a grenade or a chainsaw. I let him sweat for a second before I grabbed him and drove my knee into his solar plexus. Fake out! The look of pure betrayal on his face as he realized I'd just tricked him into a gut-shattering impact was worth more than the 5 million I'm owed. Teachers started hovering near the stairs like nervous pigeons. Ha-dong Yu was clutching her face, whispering about calling the cops, but her colleague reminded her that the principal basically gave the students a purge pass. Besides, I'm a professional. I cut the security cables and set up a signal jammer. No calls, no signals, no mercy. They just looked at the carnage. Goons were spread across the floor like discarded laundry, soaking in pools of strawberry syrup. Then there's this other guy, some muscle-bound, freak-chugging, green protein shakes like his life depended on it. His lackeys are barking about a leaders' meeting in 20 minutes. Apparently, some spy has infiltrated the school. So, the story goes that Dong Beom was some kind of child prodigy of violence. There's this memory of him making a rival eat a live earthworm just to prove a point. He was the kind of bully who thought he was untouchable. Well, he met me. Back in the restroom, Dong Beom was swinging for the fences, but he was hitting nothing but air. He couldn't understand why his world-class punches weren't landing. I decided to lower the property value of his face. I grabbed a toilet brush, yeah, the one for the literal toilets, and smashed it into his mug. I told him he had a serious problem with reach. He tried one last, desperate, air-piercing punch. I ducked, came up from the basement, and delivered an uppercut that sent a fresh spray of red into the air. He hit the floor so hard his shoes flew off. I follow up with a lethal soccer kick, aimed directly at his head. By some stroke of luck, he manages to scramble out of the way just in time, but the near miss leaves him paralyzed with pure terror. The look in his eyes says it all. He realizes, in that split second, that I wasn't just trying to win the fight. I was genuinely intending to end him right then and there. I told him the truth. My original plan was to make him a permanent resident of a wheelchair. I wasn't listening to his whimpering. I told him it was time to start with his legs. I dropped the broom. The sound of it hitting the tile was the last thing he heard before the real nightmare started. Dong Beom was having a full-blown, midlife crisis at 17. He spent those precious few seconds of consciousness reminiscing about his glory days when his daddy called him a prodigy for beating up toddlers. He thought he was special because he could clear a room of 6th graders. Newsflash, buddy, I was raised in Blackhead. While you were getting stickers for good behavior, I was learning how to dismantle human beings. He lunged at me with everything his fragile ego had left, screaming about how I was trash. I moved like a ghost, letting his clumsy fists hit nothing but oxygen. He was so desperate to land a hit that he was practically falling over his own feet. I let him wonder for about 3 seconds where I went, before I buried a fist into his face so fast, it probably broke the sound barrier. I didn't stop there. I turned him into a human speed bag, hitting every vital point until he was singing a soprano of pure agony. I finished the prodigy with a strike that sent a shockwave through the hallway, leaving him crumpled on the floor in a pose that looked like he was asking for a refund on his life. I stood over him, looking down at his blood-soaked face. He asked if I knew where I was, acting like this school was some holy sanctuary for thugs. I told him the truth. It's just a building full of desks, and I'm the guy currently checking out the furniture. He tried to call for backup, screaming at his goons to catch me, but they were too busy auditioning for statues. They'd seen what I did to their boss. They weren't about to volunteer for the same treatment. While I was domesticating the local trash, the signal jammer I'd planted was doing God's work outside. No calls, no texts, just me and my victims in a private bubble of violence. Meanwhile, in Sunhai, Im Trong-chan was throwing a tantrum because no one was answering his calls. He marched into the school with his pack of hyenas looking for blood. Some poor teacher, Mr. Duon, tried to play hero with a ruler, telling them to go back to their school. Big mistake. Trong-chan doesn't do detention. He pulled a dagger and gutted the man right there in the hallway, acting like he was just pruning a hedge. Then, because he's a professional sociopath, he handed the bloody knife to a trembling goon and told him to go turn himself in and take a 2.5-year prison sentence for the team. He treated a man's life like a minor administrative error. The hallway turned into a horror movie, students screaming while the rank 2 psycho walked away without a drop of remorse on his blonde hair. Back at Yonhai, I was giving Dongbyom some friendly medical advice. I told him to look into physical therapy because I'd rearranged his ankle so badly he'd be spending the rest of his life in a wheelchair. He started laughing like a maniac, telling me I was a dead man walking because their leader was coming. Suddenly, a leg came flying at my skull like a heat-seeking missile. I didn't even turn around. I just threw up a block. The impact was so heavy I could literally see steam rising from the friction on my forearm. The new challenger was Park Jin-soo, rank 3. He was huge, shirtless, and looking for a fight. He claimed he was Pig Chan, the legendary leader. Donggu, still vibrating inside his stupid unicorn mask, was screaming that he was a liar, but I didn't care about his name. I just wanted to know if he was the one worth 5 million won. Jinsu flexed so hard, his veins looked like a roadmap of hell, and gave me a grin that promised a funeral. The sun was going down, the hallways were getting dark, but while we were sizing each other up, things were getting even darker down in Busan. On a massive ship cutting through a storm, the real Pig Chan, a long-haired psycho sitting on a throne of iron and regret, was busy hanging rank 4 leaders upside down like sides of beef in a locker. He'd just heard my name, and honestly, the guy looked more interested in a bottle of glass cleaner than the fact that I was dismantling his empire. Back at school, Park Jin-soo, the rank 3 protein monster, was having a mental breakdown. He was lunging at me like a starved grizzly, screaming about how unfair it was that I was dodging his punches. I decided to make it even more unfair. I pulled out a cleaning rag and snapped it against his face like a whip, leaving a stinging red welt across his cheek. The spectators were losing their minds. I was outclassing a top-tier brawler with a janitor's kit. Jinsu went full Hulk smash, his punches literally dragging smoke through the air. He called me a mosquito, so I decided to buzz a little closer. I used the rag to bind his massive, steroid-fueled arm, launched myself into the air, and drove my knee into his neck with the force of a falling anvil. The guy was durable, I'll give him that. He scrambled up, whining about how much protein he consumed to get this big. Apparently, he thought muscles were a substitute for talent. I took out a spray bottle of window cleaner and gave him a face full of chemical mist. While he was busy screaming about his burning eyes and ruined sinuses, I stepped into his space and delivered a punch that sent him staggering. The final act was a masterpiece of humiliation. I threw my own blazer over his head, blinding him completely, and then launched a knee strike into his nose that sounded like a dry branch snapping in winter. The impact was so heavy, the walls of the corridor actually vibrated. Jinsu hit the floor, bleeding out in a long, pathetic trail on the cold tile. I ran a hand through my hair and checked my watch. Phase 1 complete, I muttered. The rank 3 beast couldn't even lift a finger. I turned to Donggu, who was still vibrating inside that ridiculous unicorn mask, and held out my hand. 5,000,001. Pay up or give me the transfer details. Donggu started panicking, insisting that Jinsu wasn't the real Pigchan. I told him I didn't care. The guy said he was the boss. I beat the boss, therefore the invoice stands. I'm a simple man with a very expensive lifestyle to maintain. The next morning, the school was a graveyard of rumors. Mr. Duan, the disciplinary teacher, was in the ICU after being gutted by Im Trongchen. The 12 national groups had officially turned our campus into their personal playground. I was currently hiding out in the anime club, which Donggu considers a sacred temple of otaku culture. I was busy eating a luxury lunch I borrowed from the teacher's lounge, while the nerds whispered about the war I'd started. I told them to relax. In my experience, if you kill the head, the body stops twitching. Donggu was losing it. He was worried about the retaliation, the hospital bills, and the fact that I was eating the faculty's bento boxes in class. Then, Mina appeared out of thin air. She ditched the film club to join the anime club just to be near me. She was blowing kisses and talking about destiny, like she hadn't been stalking me for 48 hours straight. I decided to test her love by putting the barrel of my Glock G26 against her temple. I told her I'd make her destiny permanent if she didn't back off. Her reaction? She asked if it was a love gun. The girl is mentally unreachable. Suddenly, the room turned into a marketplace. Every nerd in the club was lining up to touch my sidearm. I started charging them 1,001 per pat. If I can't be a hero, I'll at least be a successful arms dealer. While I was monetizing my equipment, Donggu and Mina headed to the hospital to visit the teacher. I refused to go. I don't do sympathy visits, and I certainly don't do them for free. Mr. Duan was lying in bed, acting like a tough guy and promising to be back at work in a week. His wife was tearing into him for his ego, which was honestly more violent than most of my fights. Mina was absolutely losing it on the walk to the hospital. She spent the whole trip roasting Donggu for being a boring nerd, mostly because I wasn't there to provide the main character energy she craves. She kept demanding to know where I was, as if he has a GPS tracker shoved up his back. Donggu tried to be the voice of reason, telling her to just go home if she was going to be a brat. But Mina isn't the type to take a hint. She's the type to take a restraining order as a challenge. They finally reached the hospital room of Mr. Wang Duan, the disciplinary teacher who tried to be a hero and got a knife for his troubles. The hallway was dead silent, but the air inside the room was heavy. They stood by the door, and they could hear his wife trying to console him. She was holding his hand, talking about their 20 years of marriage and how he shouldn't keep his pain locked inside. I stood there with a box of sweets in my hand, feeling the weight of a memory I didn't want. Before all this chaos, Wang Duan had pulled me aside in the hallway. He'd seen through my transfer student act and knew I was the one keeping the family together. He didn't treat me like a criminal. He treated me like a kid who needed a compass. He'd handed me a scrap of paper with his number on it, telling me to call him if I ever needed an adult who actually gave a damn. He told me to stand tall and live with pride, because a man's self-respect is all he really owns. Now, that same man was sobbing into his pillow. I could hear him through the door, his voice cracking as he wailed about the sheer humiliation of it all. He wasn't just crying because he got stabbed. He was crying because he'd been dismantled in front of the very kids he was supposed to protect. He couldn't even look his students in the eye anymore. The hero was broken, and the sound of his despair was more visceral than any bone I'd ever snapped. Mina and Donggu looked like they wanted to vanish into the floorboards. It was a reality check. In this world, having a heart just gives the monsters a bigger target to hit. While the good guys were having a cry fest, the real predators were holding a board meeting. I'm talking about the top of the food chain, the 12 national groups. Inside a room that smelled like cold blood and expensive cologne, the big boss was holding court. This guy wore a pristine white suit, his long black hair framing a face that hadn't felt an emotion since the 90s. Im Trongchen, the rank 2 psycho who'd gutted our teacher, was currently on his knees, shivering like a wet puppy. He didn't have any of that bad boy energy now. He was begging for mercy, promising he'd catch me if he just had one more chance. The white suit didn't care about promises. He looked at Trongchen like he was a defective piece of equipment. He didn't scream. He didn't even get up. He just pointed at a pair of sharp shears he'd tossed onto the floor and gave the ultimatum. 10 million won in a week, and he had to leave his left ear on the rug as a down payment for his failure. The room went cold. Trongchen's eyes nearly bulged out of his skull, but he knew the rules. You lose to a transfer student, you lose a body part. That's the economy of the underworld. Then, the boss gave him 3 days to bring my head on a platter. No pressure, right? I decided the best way to handle an international hit on my life was to go to the arcade. I was zeroed in on a light gun game, popping virtual heads, while Donggu went on a long-winded monologue about his tragic backstory. He was rambling about how he wasn't always trash and how he'd been beaten in a bathroom for reporting a bully to the teachers. He was trying to get me to understand the weight of his suffering. I just kept my eyes on the screen and told him he should probably focus on things that actually matter, like the present. Mina was behind me the whole time, treating my murder spree in the game like a romantic date. She was snapping photos of my back, whispering about how cool I looked while I was ignoring her. When Donggu begged me one last time to listen, I gave him a flat no. He looked like I'd just kicked his dog, but I'm not a charity. I'm a freelancer. Mina tried to claim we were on a date and told Donggu to get lost. I told them both to get lost. I've got high-level killers coming for my ears and a bank account that's still frozen solid. I don't have time for a sidekick or a stalker. Donggu finally gave up, grumbling about how I'd probably just ask for more money anyway. He grabbed his lunch bag, which was actually my pork stir-fry bento I'd liberated from the teacher's lounge, and stomped off into the rain. I let him have it. Consider it a parting gift for a kid who's about to have a very bad week. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the city into a gray blur. Park Kang-yu was out there, looking miserable under a hood. He wasn't alone. He was meeting up with a massive tub of lard, who I'm pretty sure was just 3 smaller thugs in a trench coat, was currently using Park Kang-yu's face as a stress ball. This absolute unit was barking questions about my address, acting like a confused debt collector. He kept demanding the floor number and the room, but Kang-yu was busy doing his best impression of a broken record, stammering about how he didn't know and how his phone calls weren't going through. You'd think a guy who spends his life bullying people would have a higher tolerance for stress, but Kang-yu was vibrating like a cheap pager. The fat thug didn't appreciate the lack of information, so he decided to give Kang-yu a reminder in the form of a fist to the gut. Kang-yu folded like a lawn chair, his breath leaving his body in one pathetic puff of air. The big guy just stood over him, kicking him while he was down, and telling him to find me by any means necessary. It was a pathetic sight, really. Kang-yu was lying there in the puddles, questioning his life choices and wondering why he was the one taking the heat for my existence. He was basically praying for a miracle or a cop. But in this neighborhood, the only things that show up on time are more thugs. And then, walking through the downpour like the star of a low-budget horror movie, came Im Trong-chan. The guy was sporting a fresh bandage where his left ear used to be, a little gift from his boss for failing to handle me earlier. Kang-yu, sensing an opportunity to stop being the punching bag, spotted a familiar silhouette in the distance. It was Donggu, looking like he was just trying to get home without another medical bill. Kang-yu's eyes lit up with the kind of joy you only see in professional snitches. He pointed his finger like a crooked compass and screamed that Donggu was my best friend. Suddenly, the whole pack of hyenas shifted their focus. They cornered Donggu in a dark alley, the kind of place where nothing good ever happens. In seconds, his glasses were smashed into the pavement and his nose was turned into a crimson faucet. He was curled up on the ground, taking kicks from people twice his size, while the fat thug complained that he wasn't being cooperative. Trong-chan stepped forward, closing his umbrella as if the rain wasn't dramatic enough. He looked down at Donggu with those dead, shark-like eyes and started bragging about his credentials. The guy actually had the audacity to flex about stabbing a teacher, as if attempted murder of a civilian is something you put on a resume. He pulled out a butterfly knife, the blade catching the dim light, and started playing with it. He told Donggu that all he had to do was lure me out and the pain would stop. But here's the thing about Donggu. He's been a punching bag his whole life. He's heard it all. The insults, the threats, the "you're useless" speeches. He had a flashback right there in the dirt, remembering his own father calling him a waste of space and a disappointment. He saw the face of our teacher crying in that hospital bed, broken by the very animals standing over him right now, and something in him just snapped. Instead of crying or begging for mercy like they expected, Donggu found his spine. He looked up at Trong-chan, blood matted in his hair, and told him he wasn't trash. He told them that the real crazy ones, the real worthless ones, were the guys who spent their lives preying on the weak just to feel like kings. The silence that followed was heavy. Kang-yu was clutching his head, begging Donggu to shut up before he got them both killed. He couldn't believe a loser like Donggu was actually talking back to a high-ranking member of the 12 national groups. Trong-chan didn't take the criticism well. His polite mask slipped, revealing the absolute psychopath underneath. He laughed, a cold, jagged sound that didn't reach his eyes, and then he moved. He didn't just punch Donggu. He used that knife to carve a line right across his face, from his nose to his cheek. It was a move designed to scar him forever, a permanent reminder of where he stood in the food chain. Trong-chan grabbed Donggu by the face, his fingers digging into the fresh wound, and hissed that they weren't friends or equals. He was disgusted that a nothing like Donggu thought he could even speak the same language as him. He told him to keep his mouth shut and lower his head like a good little victim. Donggu was shaking, the pain probably feeling like a white-hot iron against his skin, but his eyes were different now. He was thinking about all the times he'd been kicked in school bathrooms, all the times he'd been trampled on the way home, and how he'd always just protected his head and waited for it to end. He realized that the only reason these guys were strong was because people like him stayed quiet. He grabbed Trong-chan's arm with whatever strength he had left. He was suffocating under the pressure, his face turning purple, but he didn't let go. Trong-chan was annoyed now, asking if the kid didn't understand human speech. He wound up and delivered a punch straight into Donggu's eye that would have knocked out a pro boxer. Blood sprayed into the rain, and the sky turned pitch black as the clouds opened up even more. Kang Yu was losing his mind, stuttering about how Donggu was insane for fighting back. The alley was a wasteland of discarded trash and broken dreams. Trong-chan stood up, looking bored again, and told his goons that once Donggu woke up, they should tear his mouth open if they had to, but they were bringing me to him one way or another. Donggu was drifting in and out of consciousness, lying in a pool of his own blood and rainwater. But even then, he was whispering curses. He was remembering the teacher's wife, holding her husband's hand, the quiet dignity of a man who'd lost everything but his pride. He looked up at the blurred figures of the thugs and told them that they were the ones who were wrong. He told them that as soon as they disappeared, the world would finally make sense again. He pointed a shaky finger at Trong-chan and called him trash one last time. Trong-chan froze. He turned around, his long blonde hair shielding his eyes, but the rage was radiating off him like heat from a furnace. He pulled his knife again, the click of the blade echoing against the brick walls. He sighed, acting like he was disappointed, and asked if Donggu was suffering from some kind of puberty-induced delusions. He wasn't going to wait for me anymore. He was going to turn Donggu into an example right then and there. He's got one knee on the ground, fistful of Donggu's hair in his hand, and he's actually talking about gouging out the kid's eyes just to see if he'd keep barking. It was edgy. It was gross. And it was honestly a bit much for a Tuesday afternoon. Park Kang-yu was in the background, vibrating with so much terror he looked like he was about to phase through the brick wall. He screamed Donggu's name, but the sound just died in the rain. Trong-chan wound up his butterfly knife, looking like he was ready to carve a turkey. He was mid-sentence, promising to silence the trash when I decided it was time to make my entrance. I pulled out the gun I'd been carrying and pulled the trigger. A little yellow flag shot out of the barrel. It had my name on it, Kim Do-yoon Stand. I stared at it for a second, my eye twitching. I specifically told the supply guy I wanted high-impact rubber bullets, and he sends me a prop from a middle school theater production. I felt the irritation rising in my chest. I tossed the useless piece of plastic into the mud and started walking. The fat guy next to Trong-chan, the one who'd been acting like a big shot 10 minutes ago, started pointing at me and screaming. He recognized me from the Burger King incident. He looked like he'd seen a ghost, or at least a guy who was about to turn him into one. Trong-chan didn't look scared, though. His eyes were bloodshot, radiating a kind of pure, unadulterated rage that usually requires a psychiatric evaluation. I ignored the blonde lunatic for a second and looked down at Donggu. The kid was a mess, lying in a puddle of rainwater and his own blood. I realized the shattered phone in my hand was actually mine. Donggu had swapped them on purpose to protect me. I picked it up, held it in front of Trong-chan's face, and asked if he was the one responsible for the roaming charges. He didn't answer. He was too busy being confused about who I was. Then, I saw it. My lunch, my beautiful, glistening pork stir-fry bento, was face down in the dirt. All that glorious protein, wasted because some kids wanted to play mafia in an alleyway. I felt a cold, sharp anger settle into my bones. I ran a hand through my hair and told the blonde brat that he was about to get a very expensive lesson in food ethics. Wasting pork stir-fry is a sin I don't forgive. Donggu groaned from the floor, complaining that he was literally dying while I was worrying about my bento. I told him to stay in his lane. Trong-chan started laughing. It was that wide, jagged grin that tells you a guy has completely lost his grip on reality. He called my name like it was a punchline. He thought this was going to be a fun little scrap. Suddenly, Jong-chan's laughter died mid-sentence. I closed the distance in a blur, blitzing him before his brain could even register the threat. Every strike landed with a velocity that felt like it was systematically dismantling his defense. Through the chaos, I stayed ice cold, my mind locked on one singular objective: absolute payback for my pork stir-fry. The fat lackey started having a mental breakdown, rambling about Trong Chan's legendary status. See, back when this blonde psycho was only 13, he decided to ruin a birthday party. He walked into a golden karaoke bar, the headquarters for a gang of runaways called the Heat Group, and systematically dismantled 21 hardened criminals. These were guys who bribed the cops and terrified the neighborhood, and a middle schooler with a bad attitude turned them into hospital residents in a single night. They started calling him the Devil God, a 13-year-old reaper who haunted the south side of Seoul. Cool story, right? Too bad I was raised in Blackhead. In my world, a 13-year-old who can't take out 20 guys isn't a devil god. He's a failure who doesn't get dessert. Trong Chan lunged at me like a bolt of lightning, his knife whistling through the air. I didn't even break a sweat. I moved my head an inch to the left, letting the blade catch nothing but rain. He swung again, a wild, desperate slash. I stepped back, my eyes locked onto his movements. He was fast, sure, but his technique was all ego and no discipline. I waited for the opening. It wasn't hard to find. As he overextended on a vertical slice, I stepped in and drove a fist straight into his throat. I heard the air leave his lungs in a wet, ragged ack. Blood sprayed from his mouth, decorating the pavement. He stumbled back, his eyes wide and panicked. He couldn't understand why he couldn't hit me. He'd seen the punch coming, but his body was too slow to react. It was like trying to outrun a bullet. His knife hit the ground with a pathetic clatter, and the devil god was suddenly looking a lot more like a mortal. He tried to stand his ground, clutching his neck and gasping for air. I didn't give him a second to breathe. I told him his problem wasn't that he was unlucky, it was that he was weak. I asked him why he was blaming me for his own incompetence. I stood there, hands in my pockets, and invited him to come at me again. I told him he clearly hadn't been beaten enough yet, and I was happy to provide the overtime. Trong Chan's face contorted. He let out a primal scream, charging me one last time with a haymaker that had enough weight behind it to knock over a horse. I slipped under the punch, like I was dodging a slow-motion car. I called out my moves before I made them, just to rub it in. Left hook, I buried my fist in his jaw, snapping his head back. He hit the ground, but I wasn't done. I grabbed him by the collar, hoisted him up, and delivered a series of rapid-fire strikes that turned his face into a crimson mask. He was coughing up blood with every hit, his legs shaking like a newborn deer's. I stopped for a second, looking around the alleyway with a bored expression. I told him he was actually a pretty good punching bag, and that I was lucky I still had some stress to work out on him. Park Kang-yu was back in the corner, clutching his head and mumbling about how I was a monster for doing this over a side of pork. He couldn't wrap his head around the scale of the violence. I looked down at Trong Chan. He was on his knees now, shivering, the devil god reduced to a sobbing mess in the mud. I crooked my finger at him, inviting him to keep going. I stood over him, my shadows swallowing what was left of his pride, and gave him an ultimatum. Pick a bone for me to break, or I'll pick one for you. I'm a generous guy, so I gave him 3 seconds of silence before deciding his jaw was the most offensive thing about him. In his eyes, my fist probably looked like a cruise missile locked onto his face. I could feel him vibrating, pure, unadulterated terror. He knew he couldn't block it. He knew he couldn't run. I wound up, my fingers coiling into a weapon of mass destruction, and let it fly. Psych. I stopped my knuckles an inch from his nose. The sheer pressure of the air and the psychological trauma was enough to send him reeling. He fell backward into a massive puddle, splashing like a landed fish, shivering and gasping for air. His fat lackey was standing there, clutching himself as if he could keep his own soul from escaping. He was staring at me like I was some glitch in the Matrix, wondering how a new kid could possess this kind of demonic energy. Behind me, the air felt cold. For a second, a vision of a literal monster loomed over me, reflecting the absolute terror in their eyes. To them, I wasn't a student. I wasn't even a human. I was the Reaper who just retired their king. I looked down at Trong Chan and decided to finalize his medical retirement. I delivered a kick straight to his throat, the sound of bone-meeting boot echoing through the rain. I told him he should start looking into physical therapy for that jaw, because he was going to be eating his meals through a straw for a very long time. I sat on his stomach and started the actual work, my fists rhythmically meeting his face until the devil god was just a red smudge on the pavement. While I was busy with the manual labor, the rain continued to wash the city in a gray, depressing light. Somewhere in the distance, Mr. Wang Duan was probably staring out a hospital window, sipping coffee, and wondering where it all went wrong. He thought the rain made the city look sad. I think it just makes the blood easier to clean up. I stood up, the water dripping from my hair, and looked at the remaining goons. They dropped their umbrellas, standing there soaked and shivering, waiting for their turn in the meat grinder. I didn't even have to say anything. My eyes did all the talking, and they were screaming, "Who's next?" But while I was domesticating the local trash, the real boss was having a midnight snack. In a hidden base that looked like a slaughterhouse, the floor was painted a fresh shade of crimson. A man in a pristine white suit was sitting at a table, casually slurping noodles. He had blood on his face, but he ate with the refined elegance of a guy at a 5-star restaurant. This was the real deal. He was complaining that the profit margins in Busan were lower than advertised. To prove his point, he used his chopsticks to flick blood from a wound he just opened on a captive's leg. The prisoner, a guy who used to be a big deal, was now just a screaming pincerville for the boss's amusement. The man in white didn't even look up from his bowl. He told the guy he had 2 days to clean up the city, or the next thing he'd be losing wasn't just a bit of blood. Suddenly, one of his lieutenants, a massive tank of a guy from Yonhai, rushed in with a phone. There was a crisis call from Trong Chan's cell. The white suit took the phone, his pristine fingers wrapping around the device. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing, as he heard a voice that definitely didn't belong to his blonde subordinate. "Are you Pig Chan?" I was on the other end, standing in a room full of broken bodies, holding Trong Chan's phone to my ear. I told him I was looking for him. The silence on the line was heavy enough to crush a man. The boss actually smiled, a wide, terrifying grin that made his eyes glow with a freakish light. He looked at the phone like it was a gift. The 12 national groups finally had a name to hunt. While the war was being declared over the phone, the adults were busy being useless. In a greasy barbecue joint, the headmaster of Yonhai was downing shots of soju with the teacher. The teacher was worried. He was rambling about the incident at school. He was terrified of the parents, the police, and the media. The headmaster just laughed. He waved his chopsticks around, calling Yonhai a dumpster for orphans and kids from broken homes. He knew nobody cared about us. He knew the parents were too poor or too busy to complain. He told the teacher to just let the trash burn itself out. He'd rather let us kill each other in the halls than deal with the paperwork of a police report. He raised his glass and toasted to the dirty world we live in. He was perfectly happy to let the school become a war zone, as long as his retirement fund stayed intact. He didn't realize that the garbage he was ignoring was currently dismantling the most dangerous gang in the country. I just launched Kang Hyuk Chan, the supposed judo prodigy of Yonhai, off a balcony. Most people tend to become permanent sidewalk decorations after a fall like that, but this guy had other plans. As he plummeted through the rain, I watched his instincts kick in. He didn't flail like a victim. He tucked, rolled, and performed a textbook breakfall that would have made an Olympic coach weep. He hit the concrete, rolled back onto his feet, and immediately slipped into a defensive stance, wiping blood from his mouth like it was just a minor inconvenience. I didn't give him time to catch his breath or appreciate the scenery. I jumped down after him, my boots hitting the flooded pavement with enough force to send a tidal wave of rainwater into the air. I kept my face as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. No emotion, no hesitation, just the cold, calculated intent of a guy who really, really wants his 5 million won. Hyuk Chan stood there, panting, looking at me with a mix of confusion and genuine fear. I could practically see the gears turning in his head. He'd seen me move, he'd felt my strength, and he was realizing that in a straight-up striking match, he had the survival odds of a snowflake in a furnace. But then, he got that look, the "I have a plan" look. He started eyeing my frame, convincing himself that if he could just get his hands on me, his judo background would do the rest. He thought he was a concrete wall, and that I was just a fly about to be swatted. He lunged. It was a desperate, explosive grab, his massive hands reaching out to turn my skull into a grape. I slipped the first reach, like it was moving in slow motion. He didn't stop though. The guy was surprisingly flexible for a human tank. He twisted his body, his long arms snaking out until he managed to snag a handful of my right sleeve. He gave me that smug, gotcha smirk. He actually thought he'd won. He grabbed my neck with his other hand, intending to use his hip to launch me into the next zip code. It was a classic throw, a move he'd probably used to win gold medals in his glory days. But there's a difference between a sportsman and a specialist. As he tried to pivot, I shifted my center of gravity. It was a micro adjustment, a blink and you miss it tilt of the hips that completely neutralized his leverage. He was pulling with all his might, but I was suddenly as immovable as a mountain. I could see the panic in his eyes as his perfect technique hit a brick wall. He was wondering why I wasn't moving, why his strength felt like a joke. I didn't wait for him to figure it out. I reversed the momentum, grabbed him by the waist, and used his own weight against him. I didn't just throw him. I performed a back-arching suplex that ended with his head and neck meeting the concrete with a sound that I'm sure the local dentists felt in their souls. Muffled screams and a fresh fountain of red followed. While I was standing over his twitching body, my mind drifted back. I was carrying Donggu home through the rainstorm. The kid was on my back, whispering about the scar on his nose and how it was going to be a permanent reminder of his shame. He kept asking if I'd still be there to protect him, offering to pay whatever it took. I told him to shut up before I dropped him in a gutter. He's been a punching bag for so long that he thinks bruises are his only personality trait. He kept talking about how a scar never really goes away, no matter how hard you try to forget. Back in the present, Hyuk-chon was trying to crawl away. He was shivering, his face a disaster zone of broken skin and shattered pride. I didn't let him get far. I delivered a high kick to his jaw that sent him airborne for a second time. He hit the ground and didn't move again. The rain kept falling, and I stood there, catching my breath. The silence was finally broken, but not by a cheerleader. Blue and red lights started flickering against the wet brick walls. Great. The police had finally decided to show up. 2 officers in yellow raincoats stepped out, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. One of them pulled a taser, pointing it straight at my chest. He started barking orders, calling me student, and telling me to put my hands up. He looked down at the mangled body of Hyuk-chon, and then back at me, a kid who didn't have a single scratch on him. To them, I looked like a cold-blooded murderer caught in the act. I was about to comply, mostly because I didn't want to add assaulting an officer to my list of chores, when the atmosphere shifted again. Suddenly, the cop behind the one with the taser just collapsed. Out of the shadows stepped the man in the white suit, Pig-chan. He didn't have a sword or a gun. He had a literal brick in his hand. He just used it to crack the first officer's skull like an eggshell. Before the second cop could even process that his partner was down, Pig-chan was already in his personal space. Another heavy, wet thud, and the second officer was on the ground, joining the first in the land of unconsciousness. Pig-chan stood there, rain matting his long hair against his forehead, his white shirt now stained with a fresh, vibrant shade of police officer red. He looked at me and actually had the nerve to smile. It was a wide, jagged grin that didn't have a drop of humanity in it. "Hey, this is fun," he said, sounding like he'd just found a $20 bill on the sidewalk. He told me he liked my style, that we're somehow cut from the same cloth. He started talking about the Yakuza in Japan, and how money makes violence legitimate, and how violence, in turn, creates more money. He was trying to recruit me mid-massacre, offering to make my abilities special and turn me into his newest project. He kept talking, his eyes glowing with this freakish, manic energy. He was so caught up in his own villainous monologue that he forgot one very important detail. I'm not a talker, and I'm definitely not his friend. I didn't wait for him to finish his philosophy lesson. I launched a punch with every ounce of my blackhead training behind it. It was a strike aimed directly at his jaw, delivered with enough force to liquidate bone. It should have been a kill shot, but the freak managed to throw up a guard at the last second, peering through the gap in his arms with a grin that made my skin crawl. He had the audacity to ask if I really didn't want to join his little god-tier club. I didn't give him a verbal answer. I just ran a hand through my hair, sighed at the sheer annoyance of his existence, and told him his broken record routine was giving me a headache.